Hey folks, in this video I'm going to be going over another game submitted via our Patreon page, and this game today was a classical game played online, 45 plus 30, submitted by AlwaysDoubleCheck, playing black here. And in their notes, AlwaysDoubleCheck writes, this game is probably at the edge of my current chess abilities, so would love some advice on how to improve so I can get the win next time. Because in this game, black ends up with some winning chances out of the opening and into the endgame, but isn't actually ever able to convert. So we'll talk a little bit about what it takes to win a winning position or to convert chances against an opponent who is worse. So in this game, we see knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ruy Lopez. Black plays f5, the so-called Schliemann gambit, or the Janusz gambit. White takes on f5, e4, queen e2, queen e7. Now we're not going to get into the theory too much here. I believe this is not the best way for white to handle this opening. Is actually black gets a very comfortable game right out of the gate. Bishop takes c6 is played. Instead of e takes f5, I think d3 is considered a much more solid choice for white, by the way. So ef5, e4, takes, knight d4. Here black plays knight f6. In their notes, AlwaysDoubleCheck writes that knight h6 is actually a stronger move, and yeah, indeed this one does look quite nice, attacking the f5 pawn and turning to recapture it. And if g4, if white tries to hold on to this one, then black continues to try and break things apart with g6. And yeah, indeed, black seems to be getting really good play here. So of course, this is already one improvement when you're going to play a sharp opening. If you have ways of fighting for the initiative right from the get-go, that's usually nice. But in any case, the position that black gets, I think, is quite satisfactory. After knight f6, knight c3, queen e5, nice move attacking the knight. White plays knight e6. Probably should have went for knight f3, hitting the queen and taking advantage of the pin, where black probably doesn't have anything better than queen e7 and knight d4. White can actually repeat the position. Though instead, white plays knight to e6. Of course, if white just drops back knight b3, for example, then black can recapture the pawn on f5 and has a fantastic position. So white plays knight e6 to at least force black to give up the light square bishop. And now black takes, bishop d6. Definitely no rush to take this e6 pawn. b3 and queenside castling. Now in their notes, black writes here that they considered castling kingside, but thought that white would probably castle queenside, and they wanted to castle on the same side of the board in order to keep the game in calmer waters. And so right there, we kind of have to analyze and talk about this a little bit. In general, I'm not a big fan of castling based on where you think the opponent is going to go, and then trying to castle on the same side as them or on opposite sides if you're feeling aggressive. I think in chess, you want to put your king on the best possible square, right, for the king and then for the rest of your pieces. So if you think that the king is well placed on the queen side, then that's a good reason to go ahead and castle queen side. If you think the king is well placed on the king side, that's a good reason to castle king side. If we're castling queen side because we're afraid of a sharp position or afraid of complications, this is not a great way to play chess, especially if, you know, we're playing really sharp openings like the Janusz gambit with f5. This doesn't really fall in line so well with then wanting to play for a calmer position. So my first piece of advice would be to be willing to play into sharp positions, especially if the goal is to improve. We want to be willing to play all kinds of positions. That said, in this particular position, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with black castling queenside. In fact, in these Spanish exchange structures with d takes c6, it's quite often for black to find a good square for the king on the queen side, as these pawns offer nice protection, and black can soon get the rook in on the e-file. So I think totally fine move here, but maybe not the best reasoning, and already something to think about for the future. So bishop b2, queen takes e6. And indeed, this is a safe move, as AlwaysDoubleCheck writes in their notes. But it would have been better, actually, for white to try and regain this pawn with the rook. So rook h8, maybe a little bit more active. And this one requires black, I should say, to be willing to take on e6 and leave the queen on e5 in view of some possible discovered attacks. Now this looks very dangerous, but after rook takes c6, it is nice that black is taking with the rook, as black can definitely get a more active development here. and black just has to be confident that there are no good discoveries against the queen. And indeed, there aren't. White can play knight a4, but it's just going to be at one tempo. The queen can easily slide off of the attack. So right away, we again see that black maybe needs to play in a little bit of a risky manner in order to get the best possible chances. After queen takes e6, black is certainly fine, but yeah, is not going to be fighting for the advantage as, okay, we're losing a little bit of time with this move. So the game continues, castles for white, rook d8, king b1, king b8, rook e1, rook e7, and now white plays d3 and is able to essentially equalize by trading everything off along the e-file. Though the game, of course, remains very interesting. So rook e8 takes on e4, we get massive exchanges on e4, takes, bishop takes g7, and black has rook to g4 in the end, and black is winning back their pawn. Now game continues, rook to e1, b6, stopping the back rank check, and mate, of course. And white goes bishop f8, kind of a tricky move, forces the trade of bishops, rook e8 check, king b7, rook takes f8, rook takes g2. And so we get a rook endgame in this game, which looks very, very equal. But somehow white ends up running into a little bit of trouble here. h4, rook g4, h5, white has to make sure that they're not losing the pawn, rook g5, h6, rook g6. And actually, there's no way for white to avoid losing this pawn, but it's not the end of the world because black's extra pawn is going to be in this 4 versus 3 on the queen side. So white starts pushing f4, which is absolutely fine. Rook takes h6, f5, rook h3, f6, rook f3. And here, Mr. 1 Elliott kind of, loses sight of what's important here. It pushes f7. And now this is actually a big problem for white, huge mistake, because the rook on f8 is totally stuck. And as soon as this rook moves off of the f-file, black is just taking on f7 and defending the h7 pawn. So if white wanted to make a draw here, they needed to just really make any move other than f7. Rook h8 was probably the simplest, immediately forcing a trade of pawns, and after rook takes f6, rook takes h7, of course black is never winning this with the extra pawn, as even if this pawn was a healthy one, that's still a very drawish rook endgame, but with the pawns doubled, black really has no chance. So white goes f7, and despite white's solid play from earlier, black now has a big chance to get a pretty much decisive advantage in this rook endgame, because pretty soon white is just going to run out of moves, and black is just going to take this pawn for free and defend h7. Now there's no way for white to unpin the rook and trade off these pawns as rook takes f7 defense. So c5, excellent move, king c1, and now king c6, and yeah, big mistake. I think this is maybe one of the most important moments we can learn from, although this kind of mistake happens quite a bit from both players. Black rushes, because black is trying to get the king over very quickly and win the pawn, but in the meantime allows white to totally untangle with rook a8 and at least trade off one weakness for another. And white actually doesn't play rook a8, plays king d2, but absolutely should have just immediately played this one and been very grateful that white is able to trade off the f7 pawn for the one on a7. We get a similar endgame to this in the game. Black is still doing very well with the extra pawn, but at least white has more chances to fight here. Instead of king c6 giving white this chance, black needs to be patient, just play a5, make sure this pawn is defended, and now whenever the king marches over to the f-pawn, white's rook is not going to have any targets, because rook to c8 is going to be met with rook to f7, taking the pawn and defending the pawn on c7. And then black just gets a really healthy 2 pawns up position. So for example, let's say a5, white tries king d2, king c6, king e2, black just keeps the rook on the f-file, and white simply has no moves with the rook. Now black has to be very careful not to allow rook d8 check, but there is king to e7. Black can also, of course, play king d7, king e6, and yeah, white is just losing the pawn and losing the game. So black needed to be extremely precise here, but this was one chance to win the game right here, and we just needed a little bit of patience, a little bit of time to realize that white's rook is just totally stuck here, and we can't let the white rook out. Now king c6, white goes king d2, white rushes as well, needed to take this chance to play rook a8, king d7, king e2, rook f6, and now rook a8, and now white is back in the drawing range. But game continues, rook takes f7, rook takes a7, and king e6. And yeah, maybe the wrong approach here from black's point of view. I think would have been a lot stronger just to get the h-pawn running. You get the rook behind the pawn, you start pushing this one. White's king will try to stop the pawn, and in the meantime, black's king can try to make some progress on the queen side. Yeah, decent winning chances for black, won't be super easy, but it's also pretty unpleasant for white, as the king is going to have to be stuck on this side of the board, and one day black can just switch the rook over, rook d7, rook to d2, and go after the queen side and try to win the game that way. So really good winning chances there. With king to e6, black tries to get the king over, but I think underestimates white's counterplay with a4, a5. And to their credit, white plays a4, h5, a5. I think very nice resource. Black takes. It was possible also to play king d6. This is kind of a funny resource with the point that a takes b6 is met with rook e7 check, and then black can recapture. But still, some pawns have been traded off. Black's winning chances already not as good, although the rook is getting to h7 and still some winning chances remain. Instead, we see a5, b takes a5, rook takes a5, rook h7. I think that's fine. If king to d6, then white can give this check. White can also play b4, which I think is even easier. And if white can just trade off these pawns, then that's going to be a very easy draw. So rook h7, good try. Rook takes c5, king d6. And now white is very much in the drawing zone, as the king is able to stop the h-pawn, and white has 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So how can black ever win here, right? Well, king d5, and white plays b4. Already, I think, not a great direction. Rook c4 seems like a much simpler construction, where white just keeps the rook defended on c4, doesn't allow black's king to make any progress, and the rook can just shuffle on the 4th rank between a4 and c4, and black will never be able to do anything here. And yeah, white should be holding this one very easily. Instead, b4 gives black some chances. King d4, rook b3 is played, king c4, and rook b1. Not a great move. White should have just kept the rook where it's defended, maybe push the pawn to b5, try to trade off the pawns with b6, and then again, white makes an easy draw. But after rook to b1, black all of a sudden gets a chance, unfortunately misses it, rushes again with king to c3. Now after b5, king takes c2, black has won a pawn, but white is very much ready to just trade off the b pawn for the c pawn, and then black is never winning that endgame. The rook is always going to have time to swing over, and yeah, black is just not promoting this h pawn. And indeed, the game was drawn after king c3, rook b1. Black had to repeat here, played king c4, white pushed b6, and yeah, made an easy draw here. So what could have black done instead? Well, instead of playing king c3, after rook to b1 and allowing white this plan of b5, b6, black needed to just take one tempo to stop this idea with c6. Now white doesn't have this advance of b5, and here white is actually going to be in big trouble because white is in danger of getting zugzwanged. The king on h1 has very few moves. If white goes king to g2, for example, then black just promotes, forces the trade of rooks, and black's king is taking both of these pawns, and white is lost. So since the king can never move, white has to just shuffle with the rook, and now black can slowly prepare a zugzwang. The most accurate way is to go rook to h4. This is kind of a very precise continuation, because after rook b1, king c3, b5, the point is black can play king takes c2, and white doesn't have the move rook to b4, and is again losing because now this pawn is hanging, the rook is hanging, and black is just winning another pawn and winning the game. Definitely not an easy idea to find, especially rook h4, but this move c6, this one is definitely very findable, because the only thing we need to see here is that white is almost out of moves, and from here you just try to figure out how to improve the position. You stop white's idea of b5, and we realize that actually white's king and rook are very much lacking moves here. And yeah, we have chances to just get in and possibly win this one. This was definitely a tricky win, but I think black had better options earlier, especially going back to this moment where white had already messed up. The f7 pawn is going to be lost, and black just needed to be a little bit more patient to convert this one, putting the pawn on a5, not giving white's rook any targets to escape with, and then slowly bringing over the king and winning the f7 pawn. Now, AlwaysDoubleCheck asked about this game, what could they do to improve so they can actually win positions like this? There's a couple things. Number one, as we talked about during the game, you definitely have to be willing to play sharper positions if you always want to have winning chances with black. Now, opening choice was good. We mentioned there was this improvement with knight h6 out of the opening that would have given black some fun chances here after g4, g6. Very dynamic game, and yeah, the light square bishop here is looking great. But even after missing this one, there were moments for black to play in a little bit more active way. For instance, bringing the rook in and taking on e6 with the rook, leaving the queen more active on e5, and so on. But apart from these chances, if we're then playing in a little bit quieter way, and we end up getting into these equal endgames, the important thing is to realize even in the most equalish looking rook endgames, players can make really serious mistakes and mess up. So even if we get some kind of equal-ish endgame against a player who's not that much lower rated than us, they're still often going to give us chances to win the game, which is why studying the endgame is so important, so that you're able to take advantage and exploit these chances when they present themselves. So a couple things there. Number one, be willing to play into sharper positions and sharper middle games. But number two, when you do get these kind of slightly better endgames, you really have to be patient with them and really have to try and extract your chances by being as precise as possible. And there are, of course, many, many players you can study to improve your technical play. Magnus Carlsen is one, Vladimir Kramnik, Mickey Adams, so many great players out there. But yeah, that would be the other side of things, is trying to improve your technical conversion skills. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Please make sure to leave it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please make sure to do so, as we really appreciate it. Okay, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.